The North Woods of Wisconsin in April 1934 were not merely a wilderness, they were a frozen, silent cathedral of ancient pines and biting, sub-zero winds that seemed to swallow sound and light alike. Deep within this labyrinth of ice and timber sat the Little Bohemia Lodge, a rustic sanctuary of logs and stone that was about to become the site of a massacre, and the birthplace of a ghost. Inside, the air was a thick, stagnant soup of wood smoke, cheap whiskey, and the metallic, electric hum of men who knew they were living on borrowed seconds. John Dillinger sat by the massive stone fireplace, the orange embers casting dancing, grotesque shadows across a face that no longer belonged to him. The surgery had been a brutal failure, leaving his features lumpy, his jawline distorted, and his skin a map of jagged, unhealed red stitches. His aura, which had once been a radiant sun of charisma and defiance, had darkened into something cold, translucent, and predatory. He was no longer the gentleman bandit, he was a phantom, a man who had burned his fingerprints and sliced his identity away just to stay one step ahead of the grave. Beside him, the atmosphere was fractured by the presence of babyface Nelson. If Dillinger was the cold, calculating center of a storm, Nelson was the lightning, chaotic, jagged, and psychopathic. While Dillinger stared into the fire, his smooth, featureless fingertips tracing the rim of a glass, Nelson paced the floor with the frantic energy of a caged animal, his hand never straying more than an inch from the Thompson submachine gun leaning against a bark-covered pillar. The rest of the gang, Homer Van Meter, Red Hamilton, and Tommy Carroll, moved in the shadows like ghouls, their eyes constantly darting toward the frosted windows. They had come to the North Woods to breathe, to escape the suffocating heat of the Chicago police, but the silence of the woods was beginning to scream. Dillinger felt the shift in the aura before he heard a single sound. It was a pressure in the air, a sudden, heavy stillness that signaled the arrival of the hunters. Miles away, hidden in the pitch-black tree line, Melvin Purvis was struggling against the elements and his own spiraling ambition. He was the golden boy of J. Edgar Hoover's newly minted Division of Investigation, a man who viewed the capture of Dillinger not as a duty, but as a religious calling. Purvis had received a tip from the lodge owner's wife, a desperate message scrawled on a scrap of paper. He believed he had the outlaw king trapped in a wooden box. But Purvis was a city man, a man of organized files and polished desks, and he was profoundly out of his element in the Wisconsin dark. He had brought a small army of agents, equipped with high-powered rifles and machine guns. But they were shivering, disorganized, and blinded by the very darkness they hoped to use as cover. The lore of the FBI that night was not one of professional excellence, but of a jittery, panicked aggression that was destined for disaster. The clock in the lodge hall ticked toward 11 p.m. The disaster didn't begin with a tactical breach or a shouted command. It began with the mundane, clumsy reality of life. 3 innocent civilian workers, men who had spent the evening drinking and laughing at the lodge's bar, decided it was time to head home. They stepped out into the freezing night, their breath blooming in the air like small clouds, and piled into their old Chevrolet. They turned on the headlights. The twin beams of yellow light cutting through the pines like searchlights. To the hidden FBI agents, whose nerves were frayed to the breaking point, those headlights were a signal. They didn't see 3 laborious, they saw the Dillinger gang attempting a high-speed breakout. "Halt!" a voice cried out from the darkness, but it was instantly drowned out by the roar of gunfire. The agents opened fire with a terrifying, indiscriminate fury. Winchester rifles and Thompson guns tore into the civilian car, the lead shredding the thin metal and shattering the glass. One man, Eugene Boisneau, was killed instantly, his life extinguished before he even understood he was under fire. The other 2 were shredded by shrapnel and glass. Their screams of agony echoing through the pines, a horrific overture to the chaos that was about to engulf the lodge. Inside Little Bohemia, the first volley of gunfire acted like an electric shock. Dillinger was on his feet before the first civilian scream had faded. His aura didn't shatter, it hardened into a crystalline focus. He didn't run for the front door, where the light and the noise were concentrated. He knew the geography of a trap better than any man alive. He looked at his men, his eyes cold and commanding, even through the distortion of his scarred face, the back windows. Now, he barked, his voice a sharp, rhythmic snap that cut through Nelson's hysterical shouting. While babyface Nelson stayed at the front windows, his Thompson spitting a rhythmic, chaotic stream of lead at the flashes in the woods, Dillinger and the others moved toward the second-story rear of the lodge. They didn't move like men, they moved like shadows. Dillinger leaped from a balcony, hitting the frozen ground with a jarring thud that vibrated through his spine, but he didn't falter. He rolled, came up with his weapon drawn, and vanished into the pitch-black undergrowth. The FBI agents were so focused on the front of the building, so blinded by their own muzzle flashes and the terror of the moment, that they didn't even see the ghost slip through their fingers. The forest became a theater of the absurd. The FBI agents, unable to see in the dark and lacking a clear chain of command, began firing at each other. The woods were filled with the sounds of ricocheting bullets, shouted curses, and the frantic crashing of men through the brush. In the middle of this madness, babyface Nelson decided to turn the hunt on its head. He didn't run, he circled. He moved through the trees like a demon birthed from the Wisconsin soil, coming up behind a group of agents near a service car. Nelson didn't hesitate. He stepped into the light of the car's lamps, a manic, terrifying grin on his face, and opened fire at point-blank range. Special Agent Carter Baum fell dead, and 2 others were seriously wounded before Nelson vanished back into the trees. Laughing a high-pitched, chilling laugh that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The FBI had completely lost control. The night of the ghost had become a night of fratricide and failure. Dillinger, meanwhile, was miles away, moving with a steady, relentless pace along the shoreline of a nearby lake. He was a man who had stripped away everything, his name, his family, his face, and even his fingerprints, to reach this moment of absolute, terrifying freedom. As he waded through the icy, thigh-deep water to mask his scent and hide his tracks, he felt the full weight of the price of love and the price of fame. He was the most famous man in America, and yet he was currently a nameless shape in the dark. His only companion the rhythmic thud of his own heart. He eventually found a parked car at a nearby resort, the key still in the ignition. He climbed inside, his smooth, scarred fingers gripping the steering wheel with a trembling intensity. He didn't look back at the lodge. He didn't look back at the fire. He put the car in gear and drove toward Chicago, the city that was both his throne and his tomb. When the sun rose over Little Bohemia the next morning, the scene was one of utter devastation. The lodge was riddled with hundreds of bullet holes, the once pristine snow was stained a deep, dark crimson, and the FBI agents stood around in a state of shell-shocked silence. They had killed an innocent man, lost one of their own, and allowed the entire Dillinger gang to escape into the dawn. The political fallout was immediate and devastating. J. Edgar Hoover, sitting in his air-conditioned office in Washington, was presented with a disaster that threatened to destroy his career. He had promised the American public a new era of law enforcement, but Little Bohemia had shown the world a group of bumbling, violent amateurs. The public's aura regarding Dillinger underwent a final, permanent shift. He was no longer just a bank robber, he was a legend who had outsmarted the entire federal government with nothing but his wits and the darkness of the woods. People began to tell stories of the Ghost of Little Bohemia, a man who could walk through walls and disappear into the mist. But for Dillinger, the reality was much darker. He arrived back in Chicago a broken man. The surgery was still causing him pain, his jaw was constantly aching, and the loss of Billy Frechette was a wound that no amount of adrenaline could heal. He was hiding in plain sight, sitting in the back of dark movie theaters, watching newsreels of his own escapes. And realizing that the aura he had created was now a cage, he spent the final months of his life in a state of hypervigilance. He moved from safe house to safe house, his bandaged hands always near a weapon, his eyes always scanning the crowds for the telltale signs of a trench coat or a fedora. He was the king of the outlaws, but his kingdom was a 10-foot square room with boarded-up windows. He had beaten the FBI at Little Bohemia, but in doing so, he had signed his own death warrant. Hoover had issued a shoot-to-kill order that was whispered in every precinct in the country. There would be no more arrests, no more escape-proof jails, and no more wooden guns. The next time the law found John Dillinger, they wouldn't ask him to put his hands up. Little Bohemia was the night the FBI lost its soul, but it was also the night John Dillinger lost his future. He had become a ghost before he was even dead. As he walked the streets of Chicago, his hat pulled low to hide the scars of his desperation, he was a man waiting for the final curtain to fall. The Laura of the 1930s was fading, the era of the flamboyant outlaw was being crushed by the relentless machinery of the state, and the Ghost of Little Bohemia was the last man standing in the ruins. The bullet holes are still there, in the logs of that lodge in Wisconsin. They are a permanent record of a night when the law became the criminal. And the criminal became a phantom. It was the night that proved that no matter how much you change your face or burn your skin, the aura of your past will always find you. John Dillinger had escaped the woods, but he was driving straight into the arms of the woman in red, and the neon lights of the Biograph Theater were already starting to glow in the distance.